All right. So welcome back. In today's lecture, we're going to be looking at chapter 10. So if you want to follow along, in the book, the chapter starts on page 349. If you want to follow along with the PowerPoint, you can pull this up where you found this video in D2L. But yeah, as always, remember to listen for the 4 random facts. Do both quizzes for both the lecture and the chapter in the book. And let's see. Is there anything else? I think that's pretty much it. Okay, so today with chapter 10, we're looking at adolescence again, right? So that age approximately 11 or 12-ish to about 18, give or take. There's wiggle room on both ends at this point. We're starting to get to the stages where it's going to be less like obvious age-wise when it begins and when it ends. And it's more, to some extent, it's more connected to the manner of development that we're moving through. What stage are we kind of in life socially and psychologically, as well as biologically. Okay, so adolescence, the psychosocial development is what we're looking at in today's lecture. So again, kind of that social / environmental factor that helps us to develop and to find ourselves, and looking at kind of what are the psychological goals of this stage in our development. So, okay, let's get rolling. All right, slide 2, identity, part 1. So this is the key if you want to understand what's going on in adolescents' minds. We looked at all the biology, right? Everything that's happening. We got all these hormones and all this craziness is happening, which can be both an amazing time of life as well as a very challenging time of life because of that. But the underlying factor here, the thing that is basically driving the boat, right? The thing that's driving the show to be what it wants, what we want to be, is to find out what it is that we actually want to be. Who are we? Okay, who am I? If you wanted to kind of condense all of adolescence down into one question, it could be wrapped up in that question of who am I? Right? Where do I belong? So, adolescent psychosocial development is a search for a consistent understanding of oneself. We're looking for those pieces that remain relatively consistent throughout the rest of our life, right? As we begin to find out, like, again, we're answering that question of who am I, we can kind of find those key pieces that really make us stand out compared to everyone else. So self-expression and self-concept become increasingly important at puberty. It begins in middle childhood, right? We're initially trying to kind of find our group, find our clan, and kind of the people who have similar interests to us and things like that. In this stage, we're still to some extent looking for that, but it's very much more about self-discovery at this point. Okay, we've kind of maybe figured out what we're good at to some extent, hopefully, by this point. Middle childhood, if we've done well, we figured out the things that we're good at. Now I want to know, like, what does that mean to me? Okay, so each young person wants to know, who am I? Slide 3, identity, part 2. So it's not this identity, this sense of identity has not yet been achieved. So the duration of adolescence is lengthened, and identity achievement is more complex today than it was in the past. Okay, and this is Erikson's thinking. So Erikson, when he initially came up with this theory of identity being kind of the key aspect of the adolescent stage, you figure he was doing this back in the 30s and 40s primarily is when he kind of came up with this theory. At that point, most people were finding kind of this, or answering this question of who am I, by the time they were in their late teens or early 20s. Today, it's a much more complex question, right? It used to be basically if you were male, there's a good chance that you're going to be doing what your dad does. So if your dad's a farmer, you're a farmer. If your dad works in a factory, you're going to work in a factory. Okay, you're planning on getting married, you're planning on having kids, and that's pretty much it, right? If you're a female, it might even be simpler. You're going to be a housewife, basically guaranteed, and you're going to get married, and you're going to have kids, and that's going to be your life. And so with that, the role potentials were limited, right? It's not quite the case anymore, right? We have so many choices today that this sense of trying to kind of figure out who is it that I am, what am I good at, right? Like where do I fit? All those kind of more complex questions have gotten even more complex than they used to be, which has caused us to basically kind of stretch out the adolescent period to a longer extent. Most people by the age of 18 have not really developed a strong sense of identity. They're probably working at it, or they hopefully are working at it, but they haven't achieved it yet. Okay. So identity versus role confusion is going to be Erickson's. This is this stage of Erickson. Okay, this is stage number 5. So Erickson's term for the fifth stage of development, in which the person tries to figure out who am I, but is confused as to which of the many possible roles to adopt. Right? Like I said, it used to be pretty straightforward. There wasn't really a lot of options, right? And even if you wanted to go something else outside of what your parents were doing directly, there still was extremely limited options, right? Maybe you're gonna like go big time different, and instead of working on the farm, you're gonna work on a factory. Like, I mean, there really just wasn't that many opportunities available today. I mean, like so many kids told you, you can be anything you want to be, right? You want to be the president of the United States? Go for it. Odds of that happening are really small, but who knows, right? It is technically a possibility. You could definitely get involved in government if that's something that was really interesting to you. I feel sorry for you if that is, but anyway, maybe you'll change things for the good. But yeah, we have that. We could be technically like athletes. If you're not good enough to be a professional athlete, you could become like a coach or something along those lines. Or you could be an artist. You could be a musician. There's so many possibilities of things that we could be that it can become very overwhelming to kind of try to pin it down. So identity is a consistent definition of oneself as a unique individual in terms of roles, attitudes, beliefs, and aspirations. And that's going to be kind of what we're trying to begin to pin down in adolescence. Okay, so identity achievement is Erickson's term for the attainment of identity, or the point at which a person understands who he or she is as a unique individual in accord with past experiences and future plans. You can see the string, this tying everything that has led you up to the point that you are now, leading to all the hopes and dreams that you have in the future, right? You can see how it has built you towards this destination of who you are. Okay. And that's the goal, according to Erickson. And I have met kids who are 16, 17, 18, adolescents who are 16, 17, 18, who really have a strong sense of who they are. They have their identity as it's been achieved. I've met more kids nowadays, though, that are still going, I don't know, right? Like, I know I'm good at these things, but I don't really know what I want to do after this. Including here in college, right? You're a PCC. There's a good chance that at least some of you are going, I still don't know what the heck I want to do. I'm just here trying to figure that out. So maybe this will help. Who knows? Maybe you're like, I want to be a psychologist now. But anyway, slide 4, identity part 3, role confusion. So these are some of the ways that we can kind of go bad, according to Erickson, in these stages. Okay, so role confusion or identity diffusion is a situation in which an adolescent does not seem to know or care what his or her identity is. This would be the person that instead of pursuing a goal and kind of trying to understand who they are and pushing themselves, maybe they're just sitting around watching movies or playing video games or something, right? They're not really pushing themselves. They're not really actively striving to find themselves. They're just coasting. Okay. When this happens, this is where you get the stereotypical, guy living in his mom's basement, playing video games all the time and those kind of things. That would be somebody who has suffered from role confusion, where they basically, in some cases, it can be a reaction to being overwhelmed by all of the possibilities, and with that, right, too many choices shuts us down. We like choice. Humans like choice. We don't like too many choices. It can be very overwhelming. And so a lot of times this is actually where these 3 things that we're going to find here on part 3 are connected to this state of where we get overwhelmed. And so we just kind of fall into these because it makes it a little easier. Okay. Foreclosure is going to be Erickson's term for premature identity formation, which occurs when an adolescent adopts the parents' or society's roles and values wholesale without questioning or analysis. This is the guy who's going to be a lawyer because that's what mom and dad had already had planned for him since he was born. They already had everything laid out for him. And so at 14, 15 years old, he's already striving to be this thing because that's just what he's going to be. Okay. But he never has actually stopped and gone, is this what I want to be? Is this actually who I am? And so with this, in the long term, he could end up having, basically, if you don't find your identity now in this stage, you can end up with crisis down the road. So like the midlife crisis, a lot of times is kind of a re-examination of, have I achieved so far in my life the thing that I am? Okay, we'll look at that when we look at adulthood more. But so if you don't actually ask these questions like, is this what I want to be? Is this what I'm good at? Is this what I truly like find my purpose? Then, sorry, the printer's making funny noises all of a sudden. Then that will be found at some point later. Okay. Sorry, the printer's distracting me. I'm guessing my wife is probably printing off something. But anyway. So yeah, foreclosure is just kind of that here's like the cookie cutter that's been given to you, and you just kind of fall into that position or that place. Okay. Moratorium is an adolescent's choice of a socially acceptable way to postpone making identity achievement decisions. This is going to be one that a lot of people choose to do today. And this is actually where we get in our next chapter, in the next lecture, we're going to be looking at the emerging adulthood, which is a new or proposed new age setting along the way. And it's basically a mixture of early adulthood and adolescence. It's this extension of adolescence into early adulthood. So things like going to college, right, are going to be a common example. You're kind of extending this exploration period of life, trying to figure out where you're going, avoiding so far any like real commitments. So you're not going for a career necessarily yet. You're not getting married yet, right? You're not having kids yet. All those kinds of things. You're kind of postponing those long-term adult ideas and adulting things for later, right? While I'm still trying to discover who it is that I am. Okay. And all those things can be, I mean, not all those things. Moratorium can be good, but it can also, to some extent, it can also just cause more stress on the individual, because if you still haven't found yourself by, your early 20s, it's going to lead to some issues potentially, right? There's going to be those moments of like, I don't even know who I am, which can lead to frustration and anxiety and issues like that. Okay. 5, Identity, Part 4. Erickson, 1968 to 1994, highlighted aspects of identity. So these are 4 key portions or parts of kind of figuring out who am I, right? So you're going to have religious identity. And this is a lot of times with religious identity, I found that can be a place where foreclosure occurs, right? Somebody's like a Methodist or some kind of Christian denomination or something, or they're Catholic or whatever. I guess it's also a Christian denomination. Anyway, or they're Buddhist or all these things, right? But they're not that because that's actually who they see themselves as. They're that because that's what their parents were. And therefore, this is just a tradition. This is just what we do. So therefore, this is what I do. So parents and community are going to be kind of the dominant influencer on that religious question. However, it is very possible, and it is actually important, that we explore and question our religious identity and make it a part of who we are, right? It's not just our parents. It's not just the community telling us this is what it is and this is how you should be. You are exploring it, maybe branching out and exploring other options and things, but then coming back, if you come back to the same one, coming back to it as it being part of who you are, the individual, not just something that you have just kind of grabbed onto because it was there. Okay. I mean, honestly, religious identity, religious views are probably one of the most important things you can question and really figure out where it fits in your life, because it's the most important questions in reality, right? Who am I in relationship to nature, to God, to the gods, whatever you want to look at it, right? The goddess, whatever, the universe, all these things. Like, where do I fit with all this? And what's the end goal? Like, if I got to figure out, like, what do I need to be doing now in order to basically achieve the perfection that I potentially could? So religious identity is a big one. Okay. Political identity and ethnic identity are going to be this is that part of the exploration here too, kind of looking at where do you come from? What traditions do you have? And what traditions do you bring forward? Are you from this is usually where a lot of kids end up becoming more liberal. Okay. So if you come from a conservative family, you become more liberal. If you come from a liberal family, you tend to lean liberal or more liberal. Okay. Which is to some extent kind of good. Okay. The older you get, typically the more conservative you get, which is also probably kind of good. I like Churchill had a thing where he said, any man who's under 30 and is not liberal has no heart, but any man who's over 30 and is not conservative has no brain. So take that for what it is. But that's a balance, right? But typically, this is where we're going to start questioning, like, how do I see myself fitting with the community? Like the smaller community of the family, as well as the bigger community of like the immediate community, as well as bigger like world. We're finally able to, our more abstract thinking brains are able to really grasp this idea of our connection to other people on the planet, right? And the effects that we might be having. And so with that comes a deeper exploration of our political identity. Where do we fit in society? Vocational identity is basically kind of looking at that idea of what am I good at, right? Now there is some debate on where vocational identity should fit today. With society changing the way it has and things like that, it may be less important for a teenager to kind of figure out where they fit vocationally, but it's still a decent time to be exploring that idea of kind of figuring out what is it that I'm good at, right? Where might I fit? If employment, though, like if you're actually pursuing employment for part of that vocation, it's probably not the best time to do it, especially if it's interfering with your schooling or things like that, right? Many careers also are gonna take years. It might take you 10 years to acquire all of the needed skills to truly flourish in a given career field. And so with that, it isn't something that's going to be like put in stone during adolescence. It might be the beginnings of it, but it's not going to be as concrete as it may have used to have been. Okay. And then sexual identity, gender identity, and cisgender, this idea of a kind of accepting the roles and behaviors that society associates with your biological categories, right? Male, female, things like that. Sexual orientation is going to be basically where do you fit? Both literally and figuratively, right? Who are you romantically attracted to? Is it the same sex, opposite sex, both sexes, right? There's a decent chance in this period of life that it might be both sexes because literally, again, all those hormones. But and there's going to be all kinds of factors there that will kind of help you settle where you end up settling, right? It can be past experiences. It can be just a biological tendency. A lot of times it's going to be a combination of all of those things, right? There's three main categories: the social, societal, environmental, biological, and psychological. And those three things working together are going to end up putting you where you end up being. Okay. So yeah, to some extent, we also have some control over that, but that's a whole different class. Take the human sexuality if you want to dig into that. Okay, 6, identity, part 5. Identity and depression. So a search for identity creates vulnerability to depression and anxiety. Trying to figure out who is it, like who am I? That question could be one of the most stressful questions that you can possibly ask yourself. And this is essentially what we are spending the majority of our time in adolescence really pinning down. Like that is the question that we are wrestling with. So fluidity and uncertainty about sex and gender common during early adolescence, especially for transgender, gay, or lesbian adolescents, can make this even more complicated than it already is. Right? This is a hard time in everyone's life. If you're doing something that is not the norm, it's even harder, potentially. Gender dysphoria, according to the DSM-5, describes distress at one's biological gender. You gotta also remember, like this is just, although this is a time of exploring who am I, this is also a time when you have a lot of things going on hormonally and things, and so it's not really the time to make those final choices in this area. Okay, once things have settled in, you're in your late teens, 19 or so, or early 20s, mid 20s. If you want to do something, that would be the time to really kind of make those choices or begin to make those choices. But adolescence is not the time for pinning that part down yet. It might be a time to be exploring that, but not a time for pinning it down yet. Okay. 7, close relationships, part 1. Family conflict. So parent-adolescent conflict typically peaks in early adolescence and is more a sign of attachment than of distance. If you have a healthy relationship with your parents, there's a good chance you're going to have some conflict occur. Okay, and that's because you're close, and you're kind of trying to pull boundaries, stretch your boundaries to let you explore more of the world and kind of where you fit in it. So that conflict often is going to arise. It's also the fact that honestly, in early adolescence, you kind of become a jerk for a little while, right? All those hormones and your emotions are everywhere. So that causes conflict also with a lot of different relationships in your life. But family, the people who are closest to you, are generally going to have the biggest amount of friction during this early stage. Things like bickering which involves petty, peevish arguing, usually repeated and ongoing about everyday concerns, right? There's not a lot of depth to it. It's just a little like kind of nagging at each other type of stuff. And that'll be a common factor to that conflict. Avoidance of extremes is important, right? Avoiding extremes of strictness or leniency provides best support while teens adapt to increased autonomy. So you're giving them more freedom while not giving them too much freedom. You don't want them to get too overwhelmed yet. It's a balancing act, just like it has been ever since they were 5. You figured out how much freedom do they need and can they handle, but at the same time, giving them as much as they can handle while not holding them back too much. Good luck. Honestly, that's one of those, as parent side of things, that's one of the hardest things, is trying to figure out where that individual person fits, because it's going to differ from person to person. One person's going to be super mature at age 13 and able to handle all these kinds of things. Another kid won't be even close to that mature by age 16 or 17. So it really is a matter of kind of pinpointing that individual person where they're at and figuring out what they can handle well. Slide 8, a view from science, teenagers, genes, and parents. So if you want to look at this one in the book, on page 355, it gives you the whole little study. This is kind of the rundown. This is where you can also find the graph that we're looking at on this slide. But risk score was 1 point for each of the following: had drunk alcohol, had smoked marijuana, and had sex. Okay. As shown, most of the 11-year-olds had done none of these by age 14. Most had done one, usually had drunk beer or wine, except for those at genetic risk who did not have the 7-session training. For those at genetic risk, the special program made a decided difference. What they basically did is they came up with a program to kind of help teach parents as well as the teenagers or upcoming adolescents kind of how to navigate this challenging time in life. They found that there's a genetic factor. I'm trying to remember where that one is exactly. Oh, there we go. It's the allele of the 5-HTTLPR. It's basically a genetic marker on your genes, on your DNA. What they found is that people that had this certain allele, this certain shift, were at higher risk of risky behavior. And so they gave one group a certain class, okay, and they gave another group the other group didn't have a class, and then they saw how they progressed. And what they found was that the kids that were at risk genetically and did the class were actually slightly better off than the kids who didn't have the risk at all. The kids who had the risk and didn't get the class were by far the most likely to experiment with these more risky behaviors. Okay, but yeah, you can read that whole thing. It gives you more details on that. Interesting little study, kind of looking at the potentials there of the nurture aspect combined with the nature aspect, right? Our genetic tendencies combined with the classes and teachings that we get in our nurturing environment. Okay. First random fact, before we go into the next slide. First random fact. Captive tigers in the U.S. alone outnumber the amount of wild tigers in the world today, which is pretty weird. We're living in a world, I'm thankful for the fact that we've been actually putting tigers in zoos and things to try to kind of get those numbers up, but it's sad when there's more tigers in captivity just in the United States than there is wild in the entire world. So anyway, okay. Slide 9, close relationships part 2. So there's 4 aspects of family closeness. Communication. Do parents and teens talk openly with one another? Support. Do they rely on one another? Connectedness. How emotionally close are they? And control. Do parents encourage or limit adolescent independence? So every family is going to have different levels. These are like sliding scales, right? Every family is going to have different levels of each of these different four things, and depending on how they combine, is going to really determine how the adolescent is able to connect with the parents. Some of these we want to see high levels of, for sure, like communication. We always want to see high levels of communication, right? If you have two-way conversations going all the time or regularly, generally you're gonna kind of bypass a lot of emotional hiccups along the way. Support's another big one, right? But we also don't want too much support, right? At some point, support can become a crutch. So you want to be able to have that place to come back and get the support you need, but you also got to be able to let it go and push forward on your own. Connectedness, how emotionally close are they, right? Good, strong relationships are always a positive thing, but at the same time, it can become too dependent upon each other potentially. And then control kind of falls along that same area, right? Control is good, but not too much. Balancing act between all these things. Communication is probably the only one that I can think of that doesn't really have, like, you can't have too much communication necessarily. I guess maybe if the parents are sharing too much personal information, or if there's conflict in the family or things like that, that could be too much communication. But generally speaking, like the teen side of things, like sharing what they're struggling with and things like that with the parents is usually beneficial, assuming that it's a healthy relationship. Okay. Interesting thing, like with dependence, so that connectedness and all these things. Adolescents are typically going to be more dependent upon their parents if they're female and if they're from a minority ethnic group. This can be good or bad, right? Really depending on the individual, depending on the culture they're in. Different cultures are going to expect different levels of things, and so it really does depend on the specific circumstances of a given family and how this plays out. Okay, but anyway, slide 10, close relationships, part 3, parental monitoring. So parents' ongoing awareness of what their children are doing, where, and with whom. Generally, this is a good thing, right? Positive is going to be part of a warm, supportive relationship. When I turned 16, for example, this is for myself, right? I got my driver's license on my 16th birthday. I was pumped. And shortly after that, I got my very first cell phone. It was like this clunky, ridiculous thing. But I thought that was the coolest thing ever. But a few months down the road, I realized that I didn't really call any of my friends on it hardly ever. This is back before texting was really much of a thing. But my parents were able to get a hold of me no matter where I went. I realized it was kind of an electronic leash, which at the time I was kind of like, it's a stupid thing. But looking back, honestly, I'm actually thankful for it because we lived out in the middle of nowhere. And so that cell phone gave me kind of a safety line if something were to happen. I had friends that had hit elk or deer and cows. I had a friend that hit a cow one time. That was a rough one, but on the highway. And so if that kind of thing happened, if you had a cell phone, it potentially could, you could be in a lot of trouble and still be able to get help. So positive relationship, right? Negative can be overly restrictive and controlling, like reduce freedoms to the point where it's unhealthy, or not giving the child enough or adolescent enough freedom given where they are, right? If you're 16 and you've shown yourself to be trustworthy, you deserve a lot more freedom than when you were like 12, right, or 14. And those kinds of things. So it should be a progressive letting go, moving towards the final, leaving the nest kind of a thing at 18, 19, so give or take. Okay. Worst, at its worst, psychological, when parents make a child feel guilty and impose gratefulness by threatening to withdraw love and support. Basically, if you don't do what I say, you're kicking you out of the house. That's not a healthy relationship, right? So yeah, those are kind of three of the categories that you're going to find in these relationships and in how the parents are monitoring the activities of their adolescents. Okay. Slide 11, close relationships, part 4. So cultural expectations for parents of teenagers. Across cultures, parent-child communication and encouragement reduce teenage depression. if they feel supported and if they feel like they're actually being heard by their parents, that is one of the best gifts you can give to your adolescents. It reduces depression, it reduces suicide, reduces low self-esteem while increasing aspirations and achievements. Basically, behind every great teen, you're going to find some pretty good parents typically. Right? There's an occasional oddball that has terrible parents, and there's amazing people. But generally speaking, in this stage, you're going to find supportive parents behind them. Expectations, interactions, and behavior vary by and within cultures and within U.S. ethnic groups, right? So familialism versus adolescent autonomy. So some cultures are going to be you're more deeply connected and deeply tied to the family, right? Latino, Latina, for example, is going to be, there's a tendency toward being more deeply connected to the family, where each generation is kind of more interdependent upon each other throughout. And that's just a cultural expectation. It can be good, it can be bad, right? Same with the adolescent autonomy. Some cultures are going to be more like just, you're free, go do your thing, you're whatever. That can be good, that can be bad. It really does depend on the individual and on the family and on the culture that they're coming out of. Supportive family environment is another one that's going to have some variables, right? Generally, though, that is a good one. We want families that are kind of more supportive and encouraging to the aspirations of the adolescent and kind of helping them find who they are. Okay. But again, that's going to differ from place to place. Let's see. 12. Close relationships, part 5. Peers and parents. So peers do not negate need for parental support. Just like middle childhood, parents continue to have a very big impact on the adolescent. But it's also important that they have friends that aren't just the parents, right? So healthy parent-adolescent relationships enhance later peer friendships and more reciprocal romances. In the next stage, in early adulthood, one thing is, and when you're looking for a potential romantic partner, if you're wanting to know how they're going to treat you, you might want to see how they treat their family. Okay, because long term, once the romantic fluffy feelings float away, that's going to be the model that they've been given. So kind of seeing how their family interacts and how they interact with their family, both the men and women in their family, you will have a better idea of how they will eventually treat you and your children if you continue on that way. So parenting buffering of stress is less effective in adolescence than it was in earlier childhood, right? So early childhood, middle childhood, the parents can really buffer a lot of things that are causing stress in the life, right? At this point, adolescents should be and really need to be learning how to deal with stress on their own because they're moving towards adulthood. This is training ground for adulthood. And if you try to buffer it, it's going to be more difficult to do so because of their advanced thinking now will allow them to kind of see through it if you're throwing a weird thing at them. Okay, you're like, here's a story, and they're like, whatever. 13. Close relationships, part 6. Peer pressure. So peer pressure provides encouragement to conform to one's friends in behavior, dress, and attitude. This can be good or bad. It's usually considered negative, right? Such as when you're getting encouraged to, when peers encourage one another to defy adult authority and things like that, that's generally considered a negative thing. But it can also be positive, right? It just really depends on who it is that's around you. If you're surrounded by good people, you're going to try to conform to those good people, and thus it can really improve you. On the other hand, if you're surrounded by negative people or people who are maybe do some practices that aren't so smart, that's more likely what you're going to fall into also, right? The idea of like, there's an old saying of, if you show me your 5 closest friends and I can show you who you are, that really does hold true from this point forward. Okay. Technically even holds true in middle childhood, but it really starts to come forward in this period of life. So if you, in this stage, it's important that you pick friends who are going to be giving you positive peer pressure rather than negative peer pressure. Okay. Slide 14, close relationships, part 7. Adolescents use social media to strengthen existing friendships. So 92% of 13 to 17-year-olds go online daily. That's a lot, right? 24% are online almost constantly, which is a whole lot. 1 out of 4 approximately are just basically nonstop online. Internet may provide support for non-normative adolescence, especially if you're in smaller communities. So this can be an opportunity to basically find people to connect with when you can't find people to connect with on your own, right? If you're in a small community, like I say, maybe a couple thousand or less or something like that, and you're kind of an oddball in that community, there's a good chance that you're going to have a difficult time finding people to connect with. You go online, though, and you can find a whole bunch of other oddballs, right? Which can be a very welcome thing in those cases. You can kind of find your tribe if you haven't been able to find it in person. Now, that doesn't necessarily 100% replace the in-person relationships. We are social beings. We need contact. That physical, face-to-face contact is so important for our development. But at the same time, you can also find additional support outside of those face-to-face contacts if you are in a limited community, right? So this is kind of this is becoming a more and more interesting and more complex thing as time progresses. When I was a kid, this wasn't really an option, or barely was, right? Like there was some, you could find weird little forums and things eventually when I was like an adolescent, but it took a lot of effort. Social media has made things a lot easier compared to those. Okay, 15, close relationships, part 8. Immediacy of peers. So peers nearby at a moment are the most influential. So you could have good friends, you could have crummy friends, but if the crummy friends are the ones that are closest to you as far as just in proximity, or you see them more regularly, they're the ones that are going to have the most influence upon who you become. Deviancy training is destructive peer support in which one person shows another how to rebel against authority or resist the social norms. These are generally, deviancy training would be generally considered a negative thing, which unless the culture itself is just broken, it makes sense that this would not be something you'd want to have happening. Parents need to be somewhat monitoring who it is that their kids are or their adolescents are spending time with to kind of see the road that they might be heading down. Okay. 16, close relationships, part 9. Selection and facilitation are evident, lifelong, but the balance between the two shifts. So selection is teenagers select friends whose values and interests they share, abandoning friends who follow other paths. And this is why we talked about this in the last chapter, I think. But this is why you can have this kind of this shifting, right? When you go from, you have friends maybe from kindergarten and everything has been great, and you hit adolescence and all of a sudden it's like, man, we just don't get it anymore, and you kind of, the friendships kind of break up and break apart. That's part of this happening. In some cases, it can come closer, but you're very rarely going to have a friend that you remain the same through this period. It's either going to get tighter or you're going to push apart. There's not any between of those two things. Facilitation, where peers facilitate both destructive and constructive behaviors in one another, right? Where peer pressure happens in every case, and so it can be positive or negative. Make it easier to do both the wrong thing and the right thing, and it helps individuals do things that they would be unlikely to do on their own, positive or negative. We talked about this in the last chapter, I believe, also, or the risk factor, right? Kind of that Wolverine mentality. If we are by ourselves, an adolescent, with no one around us, no audience whatsoever, we are likely we're likely to actually be very safe, right? Not take a lot of risks. You throw one person into the mix beyond yourself, and suddenly the risk factor goes up substantially. And then each additional person you add to that group, and the risk factor keeps going up and up and up, and basically they kind of feed off each other and do these riskier behaviors. Those risky behaviors could be positive or they could be negative, right? It could be good, clean fun. It could be absolute stupidity. It could be illegal. Those are the potentials you have that are out there. So, but yeah, this is a time of kind of, as we are discovering ourselves, we are also discovering our friends, and we use our friends as mirrors to reflect back to us. So we conform. We are looking. There was a comic. I don't know if you probably have read the Zitz comic about the 16-year-old kid. Long time ago, there was one, and his mom was saying something. He's like, she was asking why he dresses the way he does. And he's like, because I'm an individual. This is just who I am. I got to express myself as who I am and my individuality. And then there's the doorbell rings, and he opens the door, and it's all his friends, and they're all dressed identical. And they're like, hey, what's up? That's kind of this stage, right? You're looking for your individuality, but you're also doing that by trying to find a group to fit with. And so, you got the goth kids, and you got the jocks, and you got the cowboy kids, and you got the emo kids, and right, like all these different things. We are looking for someone to conform to find out my individuality in that conformation. Slide 17, close relationships, part 10, romantic partners. So romantic partners influence each other on a wide variety of things. Typically, they first occur in high school, and the selection is fluidity and rapidity mitigate against permanency. I think I talked about in this one, like the girl who came in when I was first getting into counseling, and she was like in tears because she had just broken up with her long-term boyfriend, and it turned out it was only like 6 weeks. Right, we are constantly shifting. Peer support with help coping. Perception of peer sexual activity is very influential in affecting our sexual activity. If you think your friends are all being sexually active, there's a much higher chance of you becoming sexually active yourself. On the other hand, if you think all of your friends are virgins, there's a much higher chance, or at least majority of them, there's a much higher chance that you yourself will remain a virgin for longer, at least. And yeah, romantic partners is kind of an interesting thing because we are not necessarily looking for someone to give ourselves to yet. We're looking for someone to show us who we are. Okay, early adulthood is where we found ourselves, and now we're looking for someone to give ourselves to. This is a period where I'm still looking for myself, and so I'm trying to figure out kind of who am I and where do I fit. And so therefore, my romantic partners can basically kind of potentially help me figure out who I am, at least that sexual aspect of who I am. Right, those four parts, those four key kind of components. Our romantic partners can be that. And it doesn't have to be sexual necessarily, but it can be kind of like who am I attracted to and all those kinds of things. And then how can I be attractive to them in return? Slide 18, close relationships, part 11. You can find this graph also on page 361 in our book. So U.S. high school students who have not had intercourse by grade. You're going to see the ninth graders are typically the least likely to have intercourse, which is good. They're young, right? This was done by poll. I want you to be aware of that also. So there's many versions. For 30 years, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey has asked high school students from all over the United States dozens of confidential questions about their behavior. As you can see, about 1/4 of all students have already had sex by the ninth grade, meaning about approximately one out of every four. Right, there we go, 25%, give or take. More than 1/3 have not yet had sex by their senior year, a group whose ranks have been increasing in recent years. So other research finds that sexual behaviors are influenced by peers, with some groups all sexually experienced by age 14 and others not until age 18 or older. And it really, again, so that peer group really does play, have a big factor in this. Okay, and again, you can read all that same thing I just read to you on page 361. It's just I put it in my notes to make it a little easier. All right. Before we get into this one, second random fact. Roughly 33% of cats are not affected by catnip, an herb. The euphoric tendency is hereditary. So some cats who actually respond to catnip, it seems to run in their genes. So there you go, catnip. Weird stuff. So 19, close relationships, part 12, sexting. Sexting is a whole new problem that was not a possibility 20 years ago. Okay, so it includes sending an explicit message or pictures via cell phone. It involves norms that vary from group to group, school to school, city to city, and nation to nation. It does increase the likelihood of sexual experiences, increases oral sex. So kids who participate in sexting are 7 times more likely to participate in oral sex. I've also noticed that kids who participate in oral sex don't think they're actually having sex, but they are. Okay. If you are messing with each other's genitals, you are in a sexual act, and you are putting yourself at risk potentially of sexually transmitted infections. So. Sex without condoms is 5 times more likely for kids who participate in sexting versus those who don't. It can also encourage things like revenge porn, where you share images of your previously loved one, right? At least previous person you were sexually attracted to. It's not considered pornography by many teens, but legally it is considered pornography. So this is actually becoming a pretty big issue today, because essentially, let's say you have a couple boyfriends or a couple girlfriends, and you were like 14, 15, and you're taking pictures of yourselves and sending them back and forth. You now have child pornography on your phone. You are walking around carrying child pornography with you, which is potentially, especially once you've turned 18, if you don't have all those removed from your phone, you are now an adult child sex offender and can be put into prison for an extended period of time. Don't sext. I mean, moral of the story is, it might be exciting and enjoyable as an adolescent. Don't do it. The negative ramifications are potentially so much higher. It is not worth the excitement. But if you are adolescent, there's a good chance that you're not thinking that way, which makes it even more challenging, right? Because the excitement is the reason why you're doing it, not looking at long-term possible ramifications. So if you have children, if you have adolescents, if you're an adult and you have an adolescent in your home, there's a decent chance that this is something that is happening. Even if they're not participating willingly, like they're not taking pictures of themselves, they're probably receiving pictures. There's a decent chance they're receiving pictures from somebody out there. So I would, in this case, monitoring your if they have a cell phone, monitor their cell phones and set it up. You can do things. There's several things out there that can kind of help you with it. Different programs and things that can, if you need some help, that can be something that can be useful. One older one that it's still around, and it's, from what I've heard, it works really well, is called Covenant Eyes. So that way you can kind of monitor what your teens are seeing. But it sends you a report of what they're looking at basically regularly. Worth a look. Anyway, 20, close relationships, part 13, same-sex romance. So some cultures accept and others criminalize youth who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. And it really is. It runs from everything from it's just part of the culture to some extent, to just totally rejected. You can get thrown in prison for it, to just people not caring. Anywhere in there. Parental and peer support help, but there is a higher risk of depression and anxiety with kids or adolescents who have the feeling of same-sex attraction. So sexual orientation is fluid during adolescence. To remember, that's something, right? Lots of hormones. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to land where it feels like you're going to land at this time. So sexual orientation can be, you can have a strong sense of it, you can have a weak sense of it, it can be secret, it can be unconscious, like all these things are possibilities of what it could be. But when it really comes down to is, this is the point when you need to let hormones settle down. Like if you're 14, you're not going to be able to figure out where you really land yet, right? Especially if it's feeling like you're all over the place. Wait till it settles, right? Okay. Sorry, my nose is itchy all of a sudden. 21, close relationships, part 14, sexual orientation. Person's sexual and romantic attraction to others of the same sex, the other sex, or both sexes. It has a strong potential of being fluid during teen years. Culture and cohort are powerful influences as far as like acceptance or criminalization. So you can see this on page 362. They got more information on all of this. This graph is showing how accepting in the United States different generations are of the idea of same-sex marriage. Basically, the younger you are, the more likely you are to be accepting of it. And that is what it is. I don't really know what else to say about that one. It does show that again, the younger you are, the more accepting, the more willing you are, which probably shows a change in our culture overall. So there you go. 22. Close relationships, part 15, learning about sex. So there's several places we can learn about sex. One of them is from the media, which honestly is probably one of the worst places it's possible to learn about sex. So internet provides information about STIs, often frightening and misleading. Intense exposure linked to increased sexual activity, right? The more time you spend on media looking at sexual things, there's a good chance that you are going to get more active. if not with an individual, which oftentimes seems to be the case, we are replacing the individual person, the emotions and everything, and all of the. So one of the big reasons for a romantic partner is, again, finding ourselves, but also kind of learning what's acceptable and what's not acceptable with people, right? Emotions and all that. There's a tendency today to kind of be swapping that emotional connection with another person for pornography and masturbation, which does not teach us nearly as much as a romantic partner would, right? But also takes almost no courage. It takes zero courage to type in a website, naked people. Takes some courage to go up and ask somebody, hey, I think I like you. You know, you want to go out for dinner sometime, or for a coffee, or hang out or something, right? Takes more effort. So yeah, basically media does not do a good job of teaching us about sexuality. Parents have been shown to be the best source for this topic if they do it. And that's the hard part, right? So parents are most important to influence. They underestimate their child's sexual activity. Typically, when you ask most adults, everyone is sexually active except for my child. My child is perfect, okay? And they're not active, okay? Like, they're not looking at pornography, and they're not masturbating, and they're not, doing risky sexual things, okay? Statistically, there's a good chance that if you are a parent and your child is above the age of 12, there's a decent chance that they've already been exposed to pornography, which will increase issues, right? That's something that you're talking to them about. Keep it age appropriate, but you need to be talking to them about those things, and earlier than you think you probably should, right? Especially if they're in contact with a lot of kids at school and things like that. There's a decent chance that some of those kids are exposing them to things that they might not be. They might be getting it earlier than you would expect them to have, right? Gone are the days of you got the one friend that has the Playboy hidden under the bed or something like that. It's just out there all the time. And if they have phones and things like that, there's a very good chance that they've been exposed to those things, unintentionally or intentionally, at this point. So communication are often incomplete. I had a friend at age 15, or maybe just 14 or 15. The sex talk for him was his dad gave him a Playboy and said, if you have questions, let me know. And that was it. Okay. That is inadequate, to say the least. That is not the way to do it, right? That's basically from the media. That's essentially what you got. You need to have conversation, and have that conversation be open. What that basically taught my friend was that his dad really didn't give a rip about what he did. Didn't really want to talk about it, didn't really want to touch it. And so therefore it was up to him to kind of figure it out on his own. Have a conversation. If you have adolescents, have a conversation. If you are an adolescent, this is probably not the thing you want to hear, but open up a conversation, if at all possible, with your parents. Ask them for advice, or at least maybe an adult that you trust, that has proven themselves to be trustworthy. Somebody who has experience in real life relationships and things versus the media, right? Okay. That's best case scenario. More likely, for a lot of kids, that's not going to happen, but that is the best case scenario. So media is probably the worst. Learn about sex, slide 23, close relationships, part 16. From peers is going to be one that we is kind of a go-to for a lot of people. This is the blind asking, like leading the blind, basically, right? So same-sex friends are most common confidants. We go, like, guys are going to go to guys and be like, what would you do in this situation? Or girls are going to girls and going, what do you do in this situation? Most of the advice that you're going to be getting from them is garbage. So just accept that. But it feels good. It kind of makes you feel like you're bonding with someone. It also is a potential for bragging time on both sexes' sides. So partners teach each other more about pleasure than consequences. They're not looking long-term. They're looking at what can I get out of the moment. And so that is a struggle for sure. Okay. From educators, teacher sex education varies dramatically by school and nation. Some schools have good, some schools have programs, right? This is a hard one. It really honestly is for the educator to pin down and do it appropriately and all these things. There really aren't very many good programs available. And so this is it doesn't work all that great. Sexual abstinence only approach does extend the average age of beginning sexual activity, which generally is good, right? The closer you are to adulthood, the better for practicing these things. But you also have a higher rate of sexually transmitted infections occur because when they do, if they do decide to participate in sexuality or sexual activity with another person, um, they don't know any kinds of practices that avoid those things, and they're not really sure what to look for in those things, and so that can become an issue. The vocal minority sometimes blocks evidence-based sex education. Um, yeah, that's I don't know what else to say on that one. Best case scenario, don't have sex, right? But if you're going to, kind of a thing in this stage, because essentially when you start having sex, it shouldn't just be about pleasure. It should also be about the fact that you are mature enough to be ready to start a family, mentally, physically, and in every way. So if you're not, best case scenario is just don't do it. If you are wanting to do it though, which most adolescents would like to, in that case, do your homework before you do it. Okay. There is a lot of risk in it in multiple ways, not just the fact that you are like the act itself is the natural outcome is having a baby. The other risk factors are going to be the potential of lifelong sexually transmitted infections and all these kinds of issues that can cause all kinds of long-term problems. Not to mention the psychological problems of potentially of the deep connection that is formed during the sexual union, and then breaking that off more than likely, right? So things to keep in mind. Anyway, 24, sadness and anger, part 1, depression. So depression and self-esteem tends to be higher for boys, specifically African-American boys. Interestingly enough, in this period, they are actually ranked as one of the highest self-esteem out of all of the different ethnic groups, as well as gender and all that kind of stuff. Self-esteem dips at puberty, and there's less confidence and more depression. Gradual self-esteem will increase though. So you have this blast of hormones, the sudden realization that people could be judging me, and in fact, I feel like everyone is judging me, and then that's all tied together with this dip in our self-esteem. But then with time, as our brain becomes more awake and it starts going like, that's ridiculous, you start realizing that people aren't watching you. In fact, it's probably almost depressing how little people are paying attention to you. With that realization, though, the tendency to depression begins to deteriorate, and we begin to become happier again. Universal trends, gender, cultural, ethnicity, and family effects. All of these things can have positive or negative effects upon our state of depression. So, clinical depression is feelings of hopelessness, lethargy, and worthlessness that last for 2 weeks or more. You can pretty much guarantee in this stage that the vast majority of people are going to experience depression at some point. Okay, it's almost guaranteed. Yeah, I mean, it's very, very rare there's kind of an individual that has zero depression at this stage. If it lasts for more than 2 weeks, though, at a time in a stretch, that's a little bit on the rarer side also. At that point, you really do need to seek out some kind of help. So if you feel depressed for a longer period than 2 weeks, seek out help. Go talk to a counselor or something, or a trusted friend, or if you're an adolescent, a trusted adult is the best, because they can kind of help you with getting the resources you need to pull things together a little better. Okay. It's a combination of biological and psychological stresses that can affect it. Differential susceptibility, for example, they found that people who have the allele of the 5-HTT-LPR, they are more susceptible to depression than people who don't. And so there are several factors there that can lead to this. So your genes, right? Also, your genes can have an effect upon you. Hormones that are present, right? That's actually one of the main reasons why suddenly depression becomes a thing, is this blast of hormones. Your individual vulnerability, all these different susceptibility issues, your experiences you've had, how resilient are you or not in this given situation. And then if you are more or less likely to seek out active care and early care. that can greatly decrease the overall effects of the depression upon you if you look for someone to help you early on. Okay. 25, and these are things to teach adolescents. If you have adolescents in your life, spread this information, right? If you're still an adolescent, think about this stuff. So, slide 25, sadness and anger, part 2. Major depressive disorder is a feeling of deep sadness and hopelessness that disrupts all normal regular activities. The likelihood of this happening doubles during adolescence. And again, there's that differential susceptibility. There's certain things that are going to cause more people to be more susceptible to this than others. If you struggle with deep depression or a major depressive disorder, it is not weakness. Seek out help. That is what strong people do. If you want to be a strong person, go find help. Okay. Depression is something that it shouldn't really be just like, I mean, you can learn techniques and things to overcome it. But if you're in the middle of it, seek out help, right? And you might be someone who needs medication because there can be different, again, hormonal balances and things. The specific wiring of an individual's brain, there's several different factors that can cause depression to occur. And in that case, medication may be necessary, at least for now. You can do things like have an exercise buddy that makes you get up out of bed and get dressed and go do some exercise. That's one of the best things you can possibly do. But seek out somebody that is willing to do that with you, right? Have that, so that way you have camaraderie, which can help with depression, as well as the physical activity, which can help with depression. Get in a meditation class, get something, do something to help you with kind of reducing the negative effects. And again, if you do that kind of thing, get a buddy that'll help keep you accountable. Come drag you out of bed and help you get dressed and all that kind of stuff. Make sure you're eating and things like that. Okay. And depression is going to affect different people differently. There's some key factors that are similar, right? But the feeling of depression in the moment is going to affect certain people in different ways. You might just feel kind of dead inside. You might feel overly like just shutting down because you feels like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. You just feel unbelievably sad and you don't know why. All of those kinds of things are going to be connected to this. Okay. 26, sadness and anger, part 3. So gender differences. Studies find that girls have much higher rates than boys, usually about twice as high when it comes to depression. So for every boy who's depressed, there are 2 girls who are depressed. Problem with this is because it's kind of like autism, right? Boys have a higher tendency of autism, so therefore boys are more likely to be diagnosed with autism than girls, even if girls are autistic or on the spectrum. So girls are less likely to get diagnosed when they should have been. Same thing here. Because girls are more likely to be depressed, they're more likely to have it like kind of caught and get the help they need. Boys are less likely to get the help that they need. Cause for the gender disparity may be biological, psychological, or social. And there's a good chance it's probably a combination of all 3 of those things to some extent. Cognitive explanation is going to be that rumination. I think we talked about this in the last chapter, that idea of you pull up something that happened and it might be something dumb or whatever. You're like, man, I wish I wouldn't have said that. And you keep pulling it up and re-going over it. That's that rumination. Girls are significantly more likely to ruminate than boys are. Again, could be biological, could be psychological, could be social. But that is a fact that girls are much more likely to kind of fall into this pattern of rumination than boys are. Doesn't mean that boys don't do it. It just means that they do it less, or they're less likely to do it. So repeatedly thinking and talking about past experiences, and the talking about is probably the biggest thing there, right? Girls get together and they rehash things more often. Girls are more social generally than boys. Even boys who are extremely social, extroverted, the emotional connection is typically less. Okay. The conversation, like there's that stereotype where like a girl, something minor happens and they get together and talk about it for hours. And something drastic happens to the guy and the guy's like, dude, this thing happened. And the other guy's like, dude, that's rough. Want to go play basketball? Right. Yeah, let's do that. That's kind of the go-to. There's a tendency. The reason that's a stereotype is because it actually is relatively true for most guys, right? But that rumination, that kind of rehashing it might feel good in the moment, but it also increases the likelihood of depression because essentially you're every time you go through that same thing, you experience those emotions again. So if it was a negative thing, you experience those negative emotions again. It's kind of like picking at a scab. It might feel good in the moment, but in the long run, you're going to cause infection. That's essentially what you end up with here. And it's more common with girls than boys. Okay. Slide 27. Sadness and anger, part 4. A sec, gonna find there's a graph here. If you want to find that in the book, it is on page 368. This is suicide, suicidal ideation, parasuicide, and cluster suicides, and the likelihood of it. This is something I think that should be talked about more in schools. Sad thoughts, right, or feeling suicidal thinking isn't that uncommon. Okay. So look at the percentages here of kids who have seriously considered suicide. With boys, a little over 10% of boys have seriously considered suicide. So 1 out of 10, right? By 12th grade, almost 15%. For girls, 9th grade girls, over 25% of them have seriously considered suicide. 12th grade girls, close to 20% of them have seriously considered suicide. So the totals of 9th through 12th grades, boys and girls, almost 20% of them have seriously considered suicide. When we say seriously considered suicide, that doesn't mean like it hasn't just passed your thinking. You've thought about it, right? You've sat down and you've even kind of considered plans and options and things that could have caused it. That's big. That's a large percent, right? 1 out of 5, approximately, sit down and like think through how they could potentially kill themselves and things like that. If we realize that this was that big of a thing, it might actually make us less likely to then attempt it. Okay. So parasuicide is attempted suicide. Again, a lot more girls are going to attempt suicide than guys. They don't show on here like suicides that were completed, right? Parasuicide, where you've attempted it and it was severe, right? Like you actually had to go get medical attention. Maybe you've cut your wrists, or you have ingested a lot of pills, or attempted to hang yourself, things like that. That is, girls are significantly more likely for that kind of thing to occur than guys are. Guys, unfortunately, are much more likely to go through with suicide and in a way that is unreversible. Boys are much more likely to use very violent means of suicide, such as shooting themselves or throwing themselves off of very high objects, compared to girls. And so with that, there is a higher chance of completing suicide than there is with girls. There's different theories of why this might be. Boys oftentimes will consider it unmanly to try to kill themselves and fail. So with that, the rates of completed suicide are much higher with guys. It's also, a lot of times, the guys are less likely to be, the red flags are less noticed when the guys are doing it, for a couple reasons. A lot of times girls are, because they're better at showing their emotions, you can kind of see it building towards this, right? And so they have people checking in with them, and things are more likely to. Guys are a little bit less emotionally aware, typically. Not always, but typically. So with that, it can kind of sneak up on them as well. And then if in the moment I am feeling like absolutely this is the worst time of my life and I just don't know how to even function with this and blah, 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 and I have a means to end it now, okay, so I've just hit an all-time low and I have a means to end it quickly and many times brutally, it's much more difficult to see those red flags coming, right? And I might have a much shorter window to save that kid or to save that adolescent. Now, one thing that we do notice that we have there's kind of a focus on teen suicide, right? This is not actually the highest point of suicide. The highest point of suicide is actually early adulthood and middle adulthood, with an increasing number of seniors, like past 65, choosing to commit suicide. So this, it's an issue, right? But with this case, I think talking about it and realizing that the suicidal thoughts aren't all that uncommon. And in fact, most teens, this is right. This is seriously considered it. Most teens at some point have had a suicidal thought. There's a very strong chance that if you made it through adolescence, at some point you considered killing yourself, just at least in passing. And just statistically speaking, that's likely. Again, I think if we made people realize this, and then taught them to seek help. If you are feeling this way, talk to someone, right? Don't just go with it. Talk to someone. That is a important piece. Interestingly, there's a group online. If you Google, I was pointed to this by a young woman that I knew that she attempted suicide at one point. But she said if you Google suicide, or how do I kill myself, there's a website that is created. There's a group that are actually suicide advocates. They are seeking for legalization of being allowed to commit suicide in certain circumstances. But there's a whole series of things that they have questions and different things and steps that you need to take before you choose to do that. And their website usually is one of the first ones that pops up online. So if you type in "how do I kill myself" or things like that, they basically are put forward because even though they're pro-suicide, they give you lots of things to think about because there is no more serious decision than that idea of ending your life early, right? So they give you all the things to think about. Have you taken these steps before you have chosen to do this? Have you done this and this and that? And all these different things to kind of push you away from it until you've actually considered all of the possible options. Okay. Anyway, there's that. 28, Sadness and Anger, Part 5, Delinquency and Defiance, Resistance. So the assumption of out-of-control adolescence is challenged by data on contemporary adolescence. Teens aren't crazy. They are crazy, right? Hormonally speaking and things like that. But they're not just going out and destroying things. So adolescent rebellion may be a social construction. Adolescents will rebel. What that looks like differs drastically. I had a friend that his big rebellion, he was from a Ford family. Everyone drove Fords. They all wore the Ford, baseball caps and all that kind of stuff. And he bought a Chevy. Okay, that was his active rebellion. It's going to look different from group to group, right? I probably rebelled. I was trying to think about this the other day. Did I rebel? I think I did, but I honestly don't know how. My family was always just they just rolled with whatever I did, so I'm not sure if I really had a chance to rebel. But anyway, teenage acting out, while not unusual, is not essential for healthy development. You do not have to. I've heard some people say, if a teen doesn't rebel, then they're going to have these issues. That's not true. All the research has shown that basically you can go through adolescence and never rebel, or just do those real tiny, pathetic rebellions, right? You're like, I'm going to dye my hair green sometime or something like that. Just something kind of random. And that's you don't need more than that. You don't have to rebel to have a healthy adolescent period of life. Okay. Is it going to happen? Possibly. And generally speaking, the bigger rebellions will occur because their family is unsupportive. So they rebel drastically because they're trying to get attention, and or because they've got connected to a group of adolescents that aren't good in trying to find a replacement for their family, right? Like gang life and things like that. So does rebellion have to happen? No. Is resistance going to happen? Probably to some extent. They're pushing their boundaries, right? They're wanting to find kind of who they are and of themselves and how can they break away from the family to some extent. But it's not necessarily going to be like this, like old school, like leather jacket and motorcycle and being tough, or drugs or things like that. They might, but it's not a guarantee. Okay. 29, Sadness and Anger, Part 6, Delinquency and Defiance. Breaking the law. So prevalence of and incidence of criminal action is higher in adolescence. You take a person who has higher physical capabilities than most people are going to have at any other point in their life, okay? But you turn part of their brain off that makes them look at long-term consequences. And that combination basically increases the likelihood of delinquency, okay, like breaking the law. You also mix with that a part of the brain that basically pushes you to doing things that are exciting and new experiences, which again increases likelihood of breaking the law in some ways. So arrests are more likely with boys and youth of minority ethnic groups and low socioeconomic families. They are significantly more likely to get arrested than any other group. Okay, so if you have any of those three factors or all three of those factors, you have basically maximized the potential for getting arrested. And it partially to do with the fact, again, cultural background, as well as like boys are more likely to do things that will actually get them arrested than girls are because of those risky behaviors. Slide 30, sadness and anger, part 7, delinquency and defiance. So juvenile delinquents, a person under the age of 18 who breaks the law is a juvenile delinquent. A life course persistent offender is a person whose criminal activity typically begins in early adolescence and continues throughout life. These are the career criminals. Career criminals are exceptionally low percentage-wise. Most of the time, you're going to find that they are adolescent limited offenders. It's a person whose criminal activity stops by around age 21. Okay. I have a friend who works in the prison system, and he said they have a number like about 98% of crimes are caused by 4% of the population, right? So a very large percentage of the crimes are going to be committed by the small percentage of the population that ends up being these life course persistent offenders. The majority of, and then the people who basically commit the crimes that are not that life course, they do crimes. Maybe they get a fine, or they do community service, or they're in jail for a little time. But that's enough for them to basically change their path. That's what most people, they do one thing and then they don't do it again. You're going to have very few people that do the majority of these high-level criminal activities. Okay. Slide 31. Sadness and anger, part 8. 3 signs that predict delinquency. So these are red flags. If there is an unusual amount of stubbornness in the child, it can lead to defiance, which can lead to running away. Right? If a child and or early adolescent is exceptionally stubborn, that's kind of a red flag for that one, where they're unreasonable in all things. Now, adolescents are going to tend to be stubborn, but if it's over the top, that's where you have this issue. Shoplifting can lead to arson and burglary, because basically shoplifting shows that there is so stubbornness shows a strong sense of me and my ideas are the best, right? Shoplifting shows a lack of care for other people's property, which leads to that high levels of arson and burglary. You just don't care about their property, and you don't care about other people's rights with their property. Bullying, and I'm not talking about like a little kid just kind of being a little bit of a jerk. Like if they become like an active bully, bullying can lead to assault, rape, and murder. Red flag, not a guarantee. Bullies doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do that. But the red flag here is that bullying typically shows that you have a lack of care for the other person as a person, which makes you more likely to be okay with assault, rape, and or murder. Okay. Again, not a guarantee, but it's a red flag, something to watch for, especially if it continues in adolescence, right? Kind of like the serial killer thing where you're like killing cats or things like that, right? That stereotype, it's that kind of a thing. It's a red flag. Not a guarantee, but a red flag. Okay, 32, drug use and abuse, part 1. Variations in drug use. Most teenagers try psychoactive drugs that activate the brain. Remember, a psychoactive drug could basically be almost anything. So it could be everything from like marijuana, it could be cocaine, it could be methamphetamines, it can be heroin, it can be caffeine and alcohol, right? All of these things would be considered psychoactive drugs because they have an effect on the chemical makeup of the brain when you consume them. Prevalence and incidence increases from about age 10 to 25. So things like caffeine, obviously, culturally are more accepted, but we don't see that as that negative. But things like cocaine and the like are a little bit more drastic, to say the least. Youngest most likely to try inhalants, right? Huffing or things like that. Cohort differences exist for every drug. There are drugs of choice for a given group at a different age, right? Even in adults. So for example, back in the 90s when I was growing up, 80s and 90s when I was growing up, really the 80s even more so, cocaine was the big one of like successful people. Today, a lot of times they're actually using things that would be prescribed for ADHD and the like are kind of the drug of choice because it does a similar thing to cocaine, but they can get their hands on it a little more easily. So yeah, differences in cohort, differences in the times, right? U.S. adolescent drug, synthetic narcotics, and prescription use and smoking has decreased. Vaping has increased. So where maybe when I was a kid, the cool thing was to smoke cigarettes. Today, that is no longer considered cool, but vaping is. And they've actually been finding that vaping seems to be potentially more dangerous than smoking, ironically. Causes all kinds of different issues. So choose your poison, basically is what it comes down to at this point. This is the time, again, we're looking for new experiences. And so with that, we are much more likely to experiment with different substances to see what it does to us. Okay. Slide 33. Just a second. There we go. Page 373, you can find this graph. Drug use and abuse part 2, slide 33. It shows the likelihood of utilizing different substances over time. Alcohol is by far the drug of choice, and out of the drugs that they have shown here. Marijuana being the second most likely used drug since 1976 to today. Alcohol has been losing ground. Its prevalence has been going down, but it's still by far the dominant drug of choice for adolescents. Generally speaking, the overall tendency has been decreasing as far as drug use per capita in the United States. So that's a good thing, right? But yeah, it's still very prevalent. It can be very dangerous, especially with certain drugs like cocaine and other illicit drugs, besides marijuana, and or abusing like prescription drugs like Ritalin and things, Oxycontin. those can all be long-term damaging. Alcohol also actually can be kind of disturbing. If you abuse alcohol, the long-term potential damage, it can be very, very drastic. But the decline is a good thing, right? And the likelihood of experimenting is relatively high in this stage, even though the brain, it actually does more damage to the brain in this period than it will like as an adult, because the brain is still fully, like you're still developing. And so the effects of the substances on the brain are much more drastic compared to an adult in utilizing any of these drugs. So our brains are more likely to want us to use it, while at the same time being damaged by it is much higher risk. 34. Opposing perspectives, e-cigarettes, path to addiction, or a healthy choice? It is not a healthy choice. So I'm going to say that first thing. But anyway, support. Electronic cigarettes are less damaging to lungs and may help adult smokers quit smoking. There's debate on that one actually nowadays. They've done more research and they're finding that in fact it causes different issues. One of which though is also lung cancer, but from a different reasons. Distributors suggest that people should make their own choices, and fear of adolescent vaping is exaggerated. Challenges to that are that electronic cigarettes deliver benzene, which is a carcinogen, right? That's basically where the cancer comes from. So any kind of smoke is a carcinogen. Certain smokes are more carcinogenic than others. But even sitting around a campfire and breathing in campfire smoke will increase the chances of lung cancer because of the carcinogenic tendencies of smoke. So smoking cigarettes and the like is bad. Electronic cigarettes don't have the smoke, but they have other things that are also carcinogenic and increases chances of addiction, not addiction, of cancer. Nicotine is addictive no matter how it is delivered. And nicotine is going to have the same effects on you no matter how it's delivered, basically. The severity of the effects are going to differ maybe, and maybe the intensity of the experience of it will vary. But nicotine itself is very, very addicting. With cigarettes, when you add all the additional chemicals and things as well, it makes them even more addicting. It basically just increases the addiction potential. And potentially the same thing with e-cigarettes. All the chemicals that are utilized in the juice could potentially make it very, very addicting. Chew is another one that, again, that increases chances of jaw cancer and all these things, and saliva gland cancer and tongue cancer. But it's also the chemicals a lot of times that they add to it will make it even more addicting than it would be if it was just the tobacco on its own. So, all right, 35. Drug use and abuse, part 2, harm from drugs. Drug use before maturity is particularly likely to harm the body and brain growth, right? The body and brain is still maturing. And so when you add these substances in that affect it pretty drastically, it can alter the patterns of development. So few adolescents notice harm from drugs as use proceeds to abuse and then to addiction, even with caffeine, right? Any substance that's going to be having a fairly drastic effect on the makeup of the brain can have detrimental long-term effects down the road, but you don't notice it in the moment. It's kind of like the frog, you put them in cold water in the pot and you slowly boil the pot and the frog boils to death without recognizing that it was doing so. That's essentially what this is with drugs, right? You do the drugs, you're like, it has no effect on me. I can do it all I want. And you do it more and you do it more and you're like, I'm fine. And then all of a sudden you're deeply addicted to a given substance and you have all these long-term negative effects. I did this with chew. I used to chew tobacco when I was 18. I was working on ranches and rodeo stuff, and basically everyone chewed, and so therefore I chewed because I wanted to fit in with the crowd, right? Over the course of a couple of years, I got to the point where I could put half a can of dip in my lip and basically felt no buzz. And at that point, I realized I had a problem. And so I went cold turkey at that point, and I had a couple months of misery. And then I got over it for the most part after a couple months of headaches and irritability and my brain basically rebelling against me. To this day, I still crave a dip every now and then, especially if somebody opens a can and you smell that fresh tobacco and it does something in my brain that it wants it, but I don't imbibe in that anymore. So yeah. And that can be the case with any drug. Certain drugs are going to be much more intense in trying to quit. Meth and cocaine and all those things, if you were trying to get off of those things, meth especially, the withdrawal time is much more severe. Like nicotine is just like you crave it really badly, and the withdrawals though are basically a headache. It's kind of like, it's almost like the same as if you're getting off of caffeine. You get a headache. You're irritable, life is kind of miserable during that time, but you get over it fairly quickly. Meth is a lot worse than that. Heroin, same kind of a thing, right? It's a brutal withdrawal period. And because of that, it makes it you can become addicted, and it's much more difficult to break it because even if you don't want to do the drug anymore, you also don't want the withdrawal symptoms. And because of that, you keep taking even though you don't want to anymore. Okay. But anyway. Slide 36. Before we go into this one though, random fact number 3. Facebook will track and record nearly everything you do if you browse the web while logged into your Facebook account. So if Facebook isn't already creepy enough, they're tracking everything that you're doing online and on your computer and on your phone if you stay logged in all the time. That's one of the permissions that they get. Okay. 36. Harm from drugs, part 1, tobacco. Slows down growth. It impairs digestion, nutrition, and appetite. Basically, one of the things that nicotine does specifically is it affects how your body works with sugars. And so if you smoke or if you chew or anything, if you use tobacco or any kind of nicotine type of a deal, it reduces your desire for certain kinds of food, specifically carbs. It also has a really potentially like bleh feel if you haven't eaten well and you get too much nicotine in your system too fast. You get an overdose, basically. It's not really an overdose in the sense that it's going to kill you, but it's an overdose in the sense of like you get a super upset stomach and you feel terrible. You can see this when I have young guys that are like, I want to chew. I'm like, here, take half a can and stick it in there, and then they get super sick and they don't want to do it anymore. And that can be a factor. You might look at doing that. If you have kids that want to smoke or want to chew, it might be a strategy you could do to them. Have them make sure they have an empty stomach and find the strongest version of it you can find and let them give it a whirl. But if you are smoking, you can damage developing hearts, Nicotine is hard on your arteries. It hardens your arteries and makes it where they're less pliable, which increases likelihood of heart attack and high blood pressure. It also affects, it is an upper, so it affects your body as if you are stressed. Even though it feels calming, your body is responding as if you are stressed. Kind of an interesting, neurologically, it's calming. Physiologically, it excites your system, which can then damage your heart. It can damage lungs because you're breathing in smoke and all kinds of junk, right? Your brain, the nicotine and things, all these neurotransmitters are basically getting affected by the presence of these foreign chemicals. I mean, it might be plant-based, but it's still chemical, right? And if you're smoking cigarettes, you got all these non-plant-based chemicals happening also. It can also damage the reproductive system, making men to some extent even impotent. They can't get it up, right? And making women makes it more difficult for women to be able to conceive. So, and those can be long-lasting effects. All of these things, once they are damaged, potentially it can be a long-lasting negative effect overall. But if you've suppressed your diet, it can lead to again that you're not getting all the nutrients that you need. You're already needing a higher amount of nutrients than you did before, and so that we don't want that. Basically, it can be very stunting. Okay. Alcohol, 37, harm from drugs, part 2. Alcohol, most frequently abused drug among North American teenagers. Heavy drinking may permanently impair memory and self-control by damaging the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. In extreme cases, there's actually hospitals that are set aside for people who have drunk themselves into oblivion, literally. If you've ever seen the movie Shallow Hal, or not Shallow Hal, 50 First Dates, I don't know where that one came in. Anyway, 50 First Dates. It's a story about a girl who she had a head injury and she experiences the day, and then basically her brain resets to the day before and all that. Anyway, I'm not going to spoil the story for you, but there's a character in there called, I think his name was like 10 Second Hal or something like that. Maybe that's where I got the Shallow Hal, or 10 Second Frank or something. But he's based on a real person. And it is a possibility that if you drink too much, you literally will destroy your memory to the point where you cannot code memory for longer than about 10 or 15 seconds. It is rare, but it is possible. It takes a lot of drinking. Okay. That's extreme. But drinking, like binge drinking, where you're drinking a large number of alcohol or a large amount of alcohol in a relatively short amount of time, even done occasionally, will permanently damage the brain and its ability to remember, as well as reducing your self-control. Okay, so adolescents typically deny that they experience any harm or could ever become addicted, right? Wolverine mentality. That might affect all these other people, but I am invincible kind of thinking. Okay, and they won't think that. You're like, what makes you special? Like, I'm not special. I'm just blah blah blah. Okay, no, the reality is this is how it affects everybody. It might affect some people more drastically, and it might affect some people less drastically. But still, if you drink way too much, way too often, you are going to have negative effects. Okay. Increased binge drinking and a substance use disorder is related to parent provision of alcohol to teenagers. Typically, when teens who drink, when they are asked where they got the alcohol, they have a family member who is 21 or older who is providing it for them knowledgeably. Okay. There's usually a family somewhere in a community that's the case. Or if it's a bigger community, there's probably several families. Okay. 38. Harm from drugs, part 3, marijuana. Adolescents who regularly smoke marijuana are more likely to drop out of school, become teenage parents, and be unemployed. It's basically the nature of the beast in this case. Marijuana mellows you out to where you just don't care. And unfortunately, it mellows you up to the point where you just don't care about anything anymore if you use it a lot. And it's especially going to affect you this way if you're using it as an adolescent. Okay, it affects adults, 25 and older, less drastically. Although it still will affect you this way, especially if you use it regularly. Anyway, habitual use in adolescence is linked to memory, language proficiency, and motivation drops. It also leads to sexual impotency, especially amongst men, because essentially it reduces testosterone levels in men significantly, which can lead to all kinds of issues down the road. It's also a very strong carcinogen, which this is something that people don't talk about very often, and I'm not sure why. Marijuana smoke has been found to be 150% more carcinogenic than tobacco smoke. Now, this was the comparison to just pure tobacco. I'm not sure about cigarettes. Cigarettes might be even more carcinogenic because of all those chemicals. But tobacco versus marijuana. Marijuana is 150% more carcinogenic than tobacco, meaning there's 150% more. So for every one person that gets cancer from tobacco, you have a 150% higher chance of having additional people get cancer from marijuana if you're smoking it. Okay. And again, when you're developing, this could be cause for several different issues. Now, that doesn't mean that that there are other ways of consuming it that might not affect you in that way, but that's something to be aware of. Okay. Again, I don't know why they don't talk about that. The research has been proven on that one. 39, drug use and abuse, part 3. Results from monitoring the future study in 2016. So 16% of high school seniors report having had 5 drinks in a row in the past 2 weeks. Okay, that's a lot of alcohol. 2% smoked cigarettes every day for the past month, which that number used to be much higher. So that one actually has dropped significantly. 6% smoked marijuana every day. That part is a little more disturbing to me. The fact that there's less people smoking cigarettes than smoking marijuana is a little bit like, what is happening? This suggests that addiction is next step for the high school students in this study. Okay, and that's not a good thing. 40. This is the final slide. Before I get the final slide, let's go ahead and give you one more random fact. MIT puts all of its course materials online for anyone to access for completely free, which is amazing. So if you want to access all of MIT, MIT is internationally held in high regard for their programs and things, but you can access all of their materials for free. And if you're smart enough to do it on your own, knock it out. Like that's basically kind of their theory also. Like do it, make it happen. Okay, 40. Drug use and abuse, part 4. Preventing drug abuse. What works? DARE does not work. I will tell you that flat out. They actually found that DARE programs increase the likelihood of adolescents experimenting with drug use. One of the reasons why is that they went over the top with their examples, right? They're like, if you smoke marijuana, you're going to be like this monster and blah, blah, blah. And then somebody smokes marijuana and they're like, I'm not like a monster. So what were they, all these other drugs they're talking about, are they as bad? And so it makes you more curious about trying out all these drugs that you didn't know existed beforehand, right? Generational forgetting is going to be an issue. So each new generation forgets what the previous generation learned. I could have struggled with something, and I can tell my kids, like, don't do this because it, and they're like, whatever, right? And there's a strong tendency towards that. Or they might take my word on that for that thing, but then go a different route with another thing. As used here, the term refers to knowledge about the harm drugs can do. There's that Wolverine tendency where it's like, well, that affected them that way, but that won't affect me. I'm different, right? What they found works. Florida and California had ad campaigns appealing to the young specifically, asking them not to, right? And they had different things where they were showing like results, and like they had an ad for a little while where it was like, parents talk to your kids. That was very effective. Graphic image ads. If you live in the Pueblo area, you might remember a few years back they had a anti-meth campaign, and they put up all these ads on billboards and things, showing people like, it's like you might think it's all fun and games until you're ripping your skin off in the middle of the night and things like that. And it was pretty graphic. They found that in Pueblo during that time they had a pretty strong drop off in meth use. It was successful, and they had it up for several months. But people started complaining because they were uncomfortable pictures, right? Like these are yucky, and so they took them down, and meth went right back up afterwards. So that's unfortunate. And then parental examples and social changes. Again, parents need to be the ones. If you have so much power over every kid for every stage, if you have a good relationship with them, talk to them about it. That really does work. That's the most likely, the best thing that you can do to reduce the likelihood of a teen participating in drug use, is changing the culture. Smoking is actually another one. Like you see that the drops down to 2%, right, of smoking cigarettes. The social change on that is massive. When I was a kid, like probably 30-40% of kids were smoking cigarettes, at least. All the cool kids and all the tough kids were basically smoking cigarettes, you can pretty much guarantee. But there has been a shift away from that. I think it was a little, nicotine and tobacco was a little bit over criminalized, but in a way, I mean, it was for the good, for as far as overuse in the teenage population and the like. Okay. There you go. That's it. So I gave you the 4 random things. We wrapped up adolescence. In the next chapter, in chapter 11, we're going to be exploring early adulthood or emerging adulthood. This is a new kind of idea, and so it's this kind of weird conglomeration of adolescence that is stretching into adulthood, as well as meeting the tendencies and the needs of early adults. So we'll explore that in the next one. Until then, if you want to read ahead, go ahead and do that. But until then, make sure you do both quizzes, both for the chapter that we just went through, chapter 10, and for this lecture. And message me if you have any questions, and I will see you all in the next video. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.